So if you could start, Callie, by introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, your research interest, and your training current position.
Okay, cool. So thank you so much, Chris. This is exciting to kind of get back in the groove with you on what's going on in the fun world of augmented cognition and neuroergonomics. So my background, I'm a strange bird. I came out of applied neuroscience, and what I noted was that I don't have the right tools as a neuropsychologist to actually look at how the brain retrains itself after head trauma. And that brought me into the world of virtual environments. But when you get into virtual spaces, there's so many issues on perception and cognitive processing that are affected by both the technology and the way that the virtual world is constructed. So what I wanted to do was take an EEG approach and a near infrared approach to look at how the brain actually functions in these environments. So number one is a validity, right? So a construct validity for the use of VR, AR as a training tool and a retraining tool, but then also to understand how does the brain work in the real world? So if we can't get to the real world, can we simulate the real world? And if it's not going to be the same as the real world, then what are we getting when we're doing rehabilitation or training somebody in those spaces? So my work has focused on understanding the brain in real world spaces, but also constructing the virtual spaces so that they're more have more validity and verticality toward the perception and interaction, almost in an embodied cognition approach, so that we are immersing somebody into something that is more real world than, and again, acting like a little bit of a bridge, because sometimes, as you know, in this research, it's very difficult to actually get, and I talk with my hands, so you're going to see that. It's going to be something where, you know, you have to have a little lily pad approach to getting to the real world, and simulation has been that. Yes. But again, you know, we have to understand how to actually construct these spaces so that they are imparting the correct learning.
Okay. You know, I think it's interesting because you dropped a number of terms that we may not all agree with the definition, or may not have recognized the term, but how do you define neuroergonomics? That'd be the first one.
So to me, that's the same as looking at what Parasurman had originally envisioned for the field. And that was really looking at the brain as it was in work, right? What is the brain on work? And how does it look like when you are in a operational space and performing a task? Right. It's not just task performance, but learning as well. So I think that from an augmented cognition point of view, that was our closed loop system that was driving some of the training and learning simulators to improve and augment training. So what does that mean? Accelerating learning, being able to learn a little bit more deeply, more personalized learning. I think that's a subset of neuroergonomics.
Okay.
It's not, you know, on the same level, if we will.
Right. And generally those terms, both neuroergonomics and augmented cognition, initially were designed around the healthy brain. So these are relatively healthy people who are at work, were studying during their normal work activities, whatever that may be. How does the brain function, and how does it look when it interacts with either machines or equipment or other individuals in the workplace? And then you're adding on top of that the possibility that the brain of an individual is no longer functioning the way it should due to injury or illness or disease. And that kind of is a whole nother level. So when you started, it sounded very simple. Okay, I want to examine how, when the brain is damaged, how does that person now interact with the environment, with the world, with it's a very complex, layered task. So it's not surprising that it's difficult. So how do you tease apart all of those aspects and actually sit down and design an applied neuroscience experiment?
Oh, that's a great question. So for me, it takes a couple levels. It depends on the question that we're asking. And if I'm developing a virtual environment for that, I definitely go back to the ISOs, so the International Standards for Creating a Computer Interaction. And the reason for that is because it allows me to follow a rubric that will ingrain safety in there and put in an iterative process so that I can test it each time along the way, which is what the original work that I've done in cognitive rehabilitation is making sure that the technology isn't going to influence the end user in a negative manner. And how do I quantify the technology and the software integration? So first I have to make sure that I've quantified that. What is the interaction space? The next is when I take the next level and I understand what the outcome could be from a perceptual level. Let's say, for example, I create a virtual space that is a kitchen for training a patient. And that's something that we've done before. And we've done using your EEG system. When you have somebody in that environment, what are we looking at? Do we have engagement? Do we have a level of perception vertical so that the person is doing that task? And I can look at it from a brain space perspective. So now I bring in their real world. I look at the cue sets that are in that environment. And then when I construct the environment for the actual research, I'm not going to constrain it in the typical way that we use an experimental paradigm, right? So for us, you know, when we're looking at levels and factors within a research, there's a lot of control there, but we have to be able to create a research paradigm that looks at exploratory first, so more of an inductive set, and move that to a more deductive or more rigorous experimental paradigm, if that makes sense, right? Yes. So in one set, we're looking at what types of factors go into the deductive approach. That would be our exploratory. And then I take a more constrained approach once I figure out what the levels are that I need to pay attention to.
And in
the context of the environment and the person.
Yeah, and in the case study you described with the kitchen, you were literally creating in the virtual world, we're recreating this person's home kitchen environment, so that you needed a level of reality for them to be able to recognize and interact with all the objects in their kitchen. Correct?
Correct, and that's across the board, right? So if I'm making a depot, which we've done too, we're creating a space where we're looking at social phobias. We're taking real world spaces like a restaurant and reconstructing those with the cues that potentially trigger a response. So we have to understand the context, and I think that that's the power of the virtual environments over, you know, just maybe bringing them into some sort of space. You can sort of now control that environment a little bit better.
Absolutely. And then do you, if you're using it as part of a therapeutic process, you continue to use that environment, and then you use the brain or physiological indicators to inform how the person is responding within that environment. And then do you continue to run sort of the same experiment and iterate, or do you change it interactively as the person's brain changes, essentially?
I think that would be the goal, because in some of the clinical applications where we've used the EEG, that would be with patients who actually are in a therapeutic environment that they will have maybe 7 weeks of therapy. Right? So we start at week 1 and we look at the brain state change. Then at week 2, again, the validity of the intervention can start to be teased out. And then by week 7, we have a whole profile based on the individual and their brain state shift, as well as the group of people that are classified as folks that need that intervention. right? So now you're looking at personalized versus somebody who falls under some sort of therapeutic title or therapeutic thematic area. I have such and such brain trauma. I present with X, right? So they are categorized for us already, but personalized within the framework of the study.
Mhm. And how are the tools that you have available currently with VR, AR flexible enough and usable enough to allow you to tailor those environments sort of on the fly, I guess is what I'm asking it. And I don't know the answer to that question. You're more embedded with, VR and AR and some of the tools. I think the approach you described is the future for many, many psychiatric neurodegenerative diseases, where we want to be able to have someone interact with an environment and change that environment to improve or have a therapeutic effect on the patient and make that very personalized to that patient. How feasible is that today versus, do we still need a lot more development?
I think we've come a huge way. I don't know how much of the persons that are going to be viewing this know about virtual environment and construct of virtual environments. But when we first started this work under augmented cognition, I don't know if you remember Janique Roland, who was making very cutting edge head-worn displays.
Yeah.
And understanding what went into that, there are perceptual issues still, even with the current technology, even though it's much more advanced. We still have cyber sickness. We still have visual fatigue and those things that could potentially have an effect on the patient population. Being able then to look at the new authoring capabilities. So what's an authoring capability? It's going to be something like Unity or Unreal Engine that everybody is going toward. Well, they're imparting different aspects, like for example, the color gamuts are different. So if I want to represent color space in a certain way that mimics a simulated environment, I might not get there. And that might be the qualifying cue that's necessary for somebody to learn in that environment. Right. So the builders of these worlds need to understand the constraints of the headset or the display itself that they're using, because it doesn't have to be a headset anymore. I mean, Apple just came out with a LiDAR system within a phone that you can map a 3D space, right? That is, amazing. I to have $100,000 tool on a robot go in and map a room. I mean, now I could just like pan my phone. That's amazing, but it still imparts issues when you're constructing the 3D space and how it impacts the human. And I don't think that we appreciate that human-centered aspect and how it affects the literature of cyber sickness, where they didn't use controls for technology. And then, we've got at least 10 theories of cyber sickness where they didn't even look at the controls for software and integration of headset. So,
all right, so we have a little way to go with the technology.
Yeah, but the guidance that we can give in imparting an ISO or a standard is still more advanced than it was 5 years ago. And I can see where we can start developing design principles for each of the areas now, like service. If Amazon wants to use a headset in their training, what would that look like? Have to be able to choose the right headset, the right software, the right integration, and then the right instructional design. And I think we're getting there, understanding those components better than just saying, oh, look, there's a $500 headset. Let me just drive all my content through it. It's a little bit, people are getting more savvy.
Yes. And the good news is there's an increasing number of choices and options, and perhaps not the rigorous experimental controls that you might like, but the technology is moving quite rapidly. So
there's ways to do it from an applied manner. You don't have to sit there and need an N of 500 to look at the validity of that headset.
Can you describe, I know you've done work in speech therapy. The example where we talked about the kitchen was someone who actually had neural damage to the hippocampal region, so they were having trouble with memory. I know you've also worked with HIV patients in therapeutic process. Maybe just give us a couple case study examples of how you've used these technologies and brain monitoring technologies in different therapeutic protocols.
So the therapeutic protocols that we're talking about have been used for persons with anterograde amnesia, and looking at how will a virtual space be able to accelerate the training. And you know, a lot of folks come in with their activities of daily living that they're not able to execute anymore. So what we wanted to see was whether or not the virtual space can allow for repetitive training in a safe environment. Now, when you use the EEG in these spaces, you have to make sure that the EEG can fit under the head-worn display. And then it's not pressing, the sensors aren't pressing on the head, right, in a certain way. So we were able to take Canon Coaster headset and integrate it with the ABM's EEG 10-channel system and be able to look at how is this going to change the brain state space, and look at, even with just the 10 channels, can we see workload level shift? Can we see engagement shift? And then the future of that is looking at the metrics. So in the current study that we did with persons that were experiencing, I guess what you would call, what would you call it? It's sort of rape evaluation. I mean, I can't remember the terms that they were using for this type of therapy intervention. So if you experienced rape within the context of the military, this program will allow you to start interacting with an avatar, and allow you to start, you know, expressing your experience with them. So in a storytelling manner. But one of the things that they were using for that implementation was a puppeteering approach. Does that type of VR, AR approach, where you have an actor puppeteering avatar, actually engage the end user who's actually in trauma? And what we noted is that environment is a little bit too much artificial for people to engage. Although we did see that, you know, different aspects of the EEG waveforms were shifting, more theta activity, etc. I think those are the powerhouses of what the EEG and, you know, related FNIR is going to bring to these types of communities, because not only will it validate the therapeutic intervention, it will tell us who is able to benefit from these therapies.
Right, right.
And that's
also,
exciting.
Some of these therapies could be administered through telemedicine, for example. If I had my headset at home and you're my therapist and we're having a session, you can say, put on the headset, perhaps drive the avatar or other experiences. I think that technology is available now. And I think we're going to see it used more and more frequently as we're in lockdown for longer and longer periods of time. What about some of your non-medical work? I know they've done a lot of work for the military, various branches, as have we. Is that more in the simulation and training domain? What are some of the studies that you've done, you know, to help our troops train faster and perform better?
I think one of the major, and again, you know, we're talking about a lot of exploratory work and how the brain can be utilized even as brain-computer interface, right? So some of the work that you and I have done was looking at bioreckoning How would we be able to translate the BCI code, the brain computer interface code, into different types of ways to trigger a environment? Again, getting back to augmented cognition, where we're trying to utilize that in a closed loop trainer, how would you be able to use those outside of the motor cortex, right? Because typically we look at BCI as being motor cortex driven, but can we come up with an alphabet that allows us to design perceptual user interfaces that make it easier to train, and that we can do things in drones, which is what my next group of work is going to be looking at, and how the BCI can be empowering that. So outside of understanding how the brain actually learns, can we understand how those communication out points can be utilized in a brain computer interface manner and facilitate things like flying a drone, or putting somebody in a indirect manner to help somebody else who might be in peril. So there's a building that's on fire. Can I utilize a BCI or a BCI controlled robot that will allow me to do something in that space where I don't have direct vision? Right? So those are types of works.
These are some of the things that you have upcoming. I was going to ask you about that. What's on the horizon for you? So brain operated drones, or brain interface with drones, or
brain interface with drones. Yeah, I think that is going to be a very interesting field of research. We have a lot of issues with operating drones, and also the workload that goes into operating a drone. Can some of that be offset? And that would be a very interesting. That is an interesting field that I'm moving into. Not behind me, but in my other room over there is the drone setup. So if I carried my computer over there, you'd see all my little drones all lined up.
All right, get the soldiers.
Yeah, I'm excited. Well, the fact is I have a 24 channel headset from yours. So that can be done with me evaluating the protocol. So I don't need 100 people trying to figure that one out.
That's excellent and important for the future. You talked a little bit about EEG and near infrared. Can you talk a little bit about compare and contrast? And then I know you're one of the pioneers who actually did simultaneous NIRS and EEG. Just talk a little bit about those various tools and how you've used them.
Yeah, so part of what we did when we were looking at the first phases of OGCOG is, what is expertise? And when we used the EEG systems, we had an idea of how the brain was functioning, again, from engagement workload, which were the metrics that you guys derived, but then also looking at the brainwave patterns throughout the training. So the aspect of resolution of the neuronal activity is very important. But each one of those, like FNIRS does something a little bit different, right? We're looking at more of a bold signature. What I was able to show in some of the work is the transition into expertise. So if I'm looking at recognizing an object and my parietal lobe demonstrates that it takes 20 times to be able to recognize that object with the same sort of look that an expert has, does that qualify the training material? So the EEG was able to tell us some aspects of the engagement protocol. The FNIR was able to tell us a little bit more about where in that brain space we're seeing the most change, and then correlating that to expert performance. So what does that allow us to do from a training perspective? And again, my goal is to look at validating these types of training protocols so that we're accelerating learning in a manner that transfers to the real world. We still are trapped in an efficacy mode where we're training in a classroom-based environment, but we don't understand that transfer of training. And I think both FNIR and EEG can help us understand that transition. And given the resolution of each and how their timing protocol works, it gives us more information together than it does, in my opinion, apart. Either one can be used separately, but together as a convergent approach, that's where I see the power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. Where do you see yourself going over the next couple of years? And if you had unlimited funding, if you suddenly got, millions of dollars, what are kind of your dream projects that you would love to do?
I would love to explore, what does learning mean to the brain? We have a lot of theoretical constructs that still rely on box drawings.
Mm-hmm.
Can we get out of the box? Right? And then understand how the brain actually learns, so that we are facilitating that brain neuroeducation.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one of the main goals for me. And again, this can be applied in the retraining of the brain from the perspective of rehabilitation, as well as training the brain within an operational space, and then just basic learning. So I think that we sort of confuse basic research with exploratory research. And I don't think that we've done enough in the exploratory realm that leads us to better deductive ideas about how the brain actually functions. So if I had unlimited funding, I would invest in the technology of EEG and NIRS and be able to utilize them within the space. Now, again, we know that this is hard. Otherwise, everybody would be doing it, right? There has to be methods in place, technology in place, metrics in place.
Yeah.
And those are the foundations that I would like to see advanced for the future. So my lab would have those components in it, as far as the technology and the capability to create the metrics that we would need to advance the field.
Fantastic. How has the whole pandemic influenced your work? Have you changed the design of your studies? What's changed?
The change has been that I have not been on travel. Otherwise, it has stayed the same, and I am as inundated as I usually am. No, it actually allowed me to take a deeper dive into where the gap areas are in the field. And because I was at home, I have my own lab set up in my house, right? So it allowed me to be able to focus a little bit more on how we need to push the field forward. So for example, what are the gaps that we have in what I've been talking about with validity of simulation toward training, validity of interventions toward rehabilitation. What does that look like? What do we need as far as metrics? How do we then approach that? Is that an NSF grant that we need to pull a workshop together maybe, and ABM and some of the other groups that have profiled equipment before get together and we do this in today's time? I just pinged the NSF to find that out and see whether or not they would be interested in funding a workshop. Because those things are necessary now. As we saw the head-worn display burgeoning field right now, how do we then construct virtual environments with the knowledge that we know? And I think that today's group has forgotten some of that knowledge. So it allowed me to see where those gap areas are and try to figure out more about how we wanted to approach design of virtual environments.
That's great. And frankly, you are the first person to say, I have a lab in my home. When you say you have a lab in your home, what does that mean? You have virtual reality equipment, you have EEG headsets at home?
I have EEG at home. I have data analytics computers. I have different types of ways of doing motion capture. The drone setup is there with the BCI. So there's
wow.
So all of that is set up in various places in my house. But that's the exciting part of being able to explore. So the data analytics computer really allowed me to look at GPU aspects and how we need to be able to utilize that maybe as a method for getting out of CPU glitches and utilizing a faster processor. right? For some of these types of metrics that we're thinking of that might be able to be used in real time. That has been an issue. And
That's
again,
always been
how
an
we need to look at the technology in integration. You know, the
Yeah,
other is that the data analytics computer allows me to look at, you know, data sets that are currently available.
yeah.
And
How
those can be pulled through.
the whole issue of real-time processing and ensuring that you have good signal to noise and you're decontaminating the
Yes.
noise is still, I think, a looming issue for any type of real-time closed loop, you know, progress in that area. Have you specifically worked on any algorithms with EEG and or NIRS where you can start to safely use those tools in real time to close the loop?
That has been an issue, and I didn't have a real need to solve that problem yet. You know, the BCI stuff for the drones is the first phase of that. And so what I needed to do first was look at the protocols that we would need in order to have more validation in the studies. So, so the next step is that. And I think that it needs to be solved too before we start looking at adaptation, or adapting a virtual space or adapting a simulator or learning tool to an individual and their training.
Right.
So directly, no, not yet, but that is in the works to take a look at, because I think that has to be something that we solve before we end up not having reached our goals. I still think that the augmented cognition approach, I want to say this, outside of information processing and the way that we view this, I think that we have an opportunity to change not only the theories that we use on brain space approach, but how the brain shifts and how that can be more functional to the individual, even if they are expressing, you know, things like, you know, drinking behavior and all of those addictions that people, how do you utilize this knowledge and be able to shift the brain? That potentially needs to have more of an online or real-time approach. And I think that that's the next step.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and it's still tricky, and we've done a number of closed loop protocols, and you know, some of them are simple where you're just looking at drowsiness and fatigue and you're going to give the person alert. Some of them were, you know, accelerating training, and again, using a relatively simple feedback protocol for accelerating marksmanship training, simple skill training. As soon as you get into the more complex cognitive skills, or you have a more complex interaction with the feedback, the closed loop, there are so many factors and so many variables that you have to control for, it gets really challenging. So I think while many of us have had some success with the relatively simple real-time feedback closed loop, there's still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done to either map to a virtual environment. What are we mapping? How many variables are we mapping? And then the timing, you know, how long do you wait? You deliver some feedback. Now you have to wait for the brain to change before you deliver more feedback or change things again. And it becomes the algorithms become very complex very quickly. I think with drone operation, that might be an interesting, you know, intermediate step where you may have 4 or 5 functions that you want to control on the drone, and a limited number of brain states that you're trying to monitor and interact with. But these things are much more challenging than I think even the scientific literature today lets on. So you see lots of BCI publications, and as soon as you look under the hood as to how they actually got it to work, it's usually almost a one-to-one, you know, one state that they're monitoring and one or two actions that they're taking. So yeah. I don't know, do you, I mean, and I've just looked at this literature recently and was a little disappointed that it hadn't expanded yet, because I think the processing tools, as you were talking about, the computer processing tools, the number and types of algorithmic approaches that we have now available have expanded exponentially. And clearly, you know, in the world of VR or robotics, I mean, there are many, many output parameters that we can work with. But the actual brain control, the actual BCIs that are being talked about are still relatively simplistic. You could disagree with me.
No, I don't. The issue I see is that there's not enough intuition about how the brain actually, I'm going to use the word compute, even though it might not be the correct term. So we're stuck in a vocabulary of behaviorism.
Yes.
Vocabulary,
Yes.
we are not understanding the constraint functions to translate, right? So this is a dynamically changing system. If we used a more cybernetic approach with an embedded system design, we might be getting out of the box again that we've contained ourselves in. And I think that the other part is, and I don't know if you remember, we used a 10-channel system to look at deep learning, a deep learning algorithm in order to understand task performance. In the tasks, there were 4 simple tasks, right? One was reading, one was listening, and they all had different contexts, right? So the other 2 would be listening and reading things that matter. Okay, so listening to things, reading things that didn't matter, and listening and reading things that did matter. And the EEG itself, because of the way that we're utilizing these algorithms, it was only discerning a binary, whether you were reading or listening, right? Well, that approach is because we're still taking a mathematical Frankenstein approach to the algorithms, and we're not using an intuitive approach, you know, as to what these numbers mean in the abstraction of brain space. And I think once we start changing how we view the brain, we will start to be able to align the algorithms.
Yes, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I see that in the BCI controller field as well, because our approach when we were doing bioreckoning was not to use the motor cortex. It wasn't to replicate motion per se. It was to take a brain alphabet that could be abstracted from the brain code and use that as the trigger in the virtual space. And again, that takes a lot of effort to figure that stuff out. So you have to also be in a academic environment or a business environment, or like your home lab, that allows you the opportunity to take the time it's going to take in order to understand the phenomena, right? Because usually in publish or perish, some of the work in academia can't get forward because it takes too long to progress. And that's also preclusive in a commercial entity because again, that's not leading to product development and design. So that's the other thing that you and I have discussed before. Is there an intermediary institution that could potentially be a think tank, or, you know, has the capability to do the groundwork that's necessary to shift the field? Absolutely.
And it requires a very multidisciplinary group, you know, ranging from, you know, obviously engineers and neuroscientists, but we need cognitive psychologists, and, you know, and we have to put them all in the same room and, you know, agree to disagree on maybe our terminology or our approach, but, you know, to fundamentally try to move this field, you know, whether it's neuroergonomics, augmented cognition, brain-computer interfaces, we need to be able to have lots of different talents and skill sets in the room. And I try to encourage students whenever I have the opportunity, you know, to be a little open-minded and not to specialize too soon. If you want to be on this sort of neurotechnology development path, it requires, yes, you want to develop your expertise, but you want to be open-minded to some of these other, you know, aspects of the field. So when you're in your home environment, I'm curious, Are you running the experiments on yourself?
Of course.
Okay. All
I
right.
present a very interesting issue because I'm partially blind.
Yes.
So even I have something akin to blind sight. So I actually can see shadows in the blind eye, but that allows me to still see some level of 3 dimension in a virtual space.
Wow.
So it's very bizarre, but it allows me to test things in a different way than other people do. And that has been an exciting aspect of, being able to work in simulated environments and be partially sighted, because you can't pull the third dimension in.
That
Right?
is very exciting.
Yeah, just as long as I don't fall down my stair.
Please don't do that.
Yeah, now running into walls 5 times. But yeah, I think the exciting part again, this is part of the exploratory process that we're not allowed to almost do within either academia or in a business environment, because it's not, I mean, even look at, throwing crap off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, where we have figuring out, well, these types of rules don't conform.
Yeah.
So, hey, let's figure out what does conform, and then bring that into the space. But sometimes we need to take the bull by the horns and do it ourselves.
All right. I love it. All right. I think on that note, we will conclude. Unless you have anything else to share with our viewers, tend to be in the neuroscience, neurotechnology area. Is there any other advice or observations that you want to share?
I think the biggest thing is to take the brain out of the box.
Yeah.
I think that we've hindered ourselves for many, many years in the box designs and some of the things that, we skip over. And if we can start filling those gaps, I think we'll see such a huge change in how we, number one, think about the brain, but think about learning. And that has been my biggest thing in my lifetime, to be able to approach and help bring forward.
That's great. Fantastic. Well,
thank you so much, Chris.